Everyone, it's Ashley. Thank you so much for joining me today for this next part in our series on creating classroom community through literature. Today, we're going to be focusing on cultivating empathy through picture books. And this is specifically an interactive read aloud planning session geared towards 4th and 5th grade. As a reminder, this webinar series is brought to you through the Greeley Center for Catholic Education at Loyola University in Chicago. And please check out the Greeley website for great free educator resources, including a one-pager that accompanies each of my webinars. Before we get started, I wanted to take a moment to connect around some great diverse books that I want you to have on your radar for 4th and 5th grade. With Dad is a beautiful story about a little boy whose father was recently deployed, and he's reflecting back on small moments that he has with his dad as he waits for his return. Another book that I want to feature is Watercress, and I actually did a planning session using Watercress for the middle grade, so you can feel free to check it out. But it's about a little girl whose parents are first-generation immigrants from China. And at the beginning of the story, she's really ashamed of her family and her family's heritage, but once she learns more about it, becomes proud of it. My Puppy Has a Motorcycle and The Proudest Blue are also really beautiful titles for you to check out. Okay, so our work together today is going to build up, it's going to be built upon the work that we've done in the first two sessions. So I want to take a moment to reflect on what we've already learned. In our first webinar, we discussed the problem that there are not enough diverse books being published, and there consequently are not enough diverse books in most of our classroom libraries. We discussed the importance of having students interact with multiple kinds of stories and text that are both mirrors, texts that reflect one or more aspects of their identity, texts that affirm who they are and their experiences, and that also serve as windows that are texts and stories that offer insight into somebody else's experience or world. We know that mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors was a term and a philosophy coined by Rudine Sims Bishop in 1990, and we discussed how we can start diversifying our classroom library to provide opportunities for every student to both see themselves in the stories they're interacting with and learn about other people. In our second webinar, we answered this essential question of when we diversify our library, when we've already done that, how can we interact with these stories, with these texts in a way that's meaningful for our students? So hi, everyone. This is Ashley. Thank you so much for joining me for the next part in our series on creating classroom community through literature. Today, we're going to be focusing on cultivating empathy through picture books. Specifically, this is an interactive read aloud planning session geared towards 4th and 5th grade. As a reminder, this whole webinar series is brought to you through the Greeley Center for Catholic Education at Loyola University in Chicago. Please check out the Greeley website for great free educator resources, including one-pagers that accompany each of the webinars in this series. Okay, before we get started, I want to connect with each of you around some great diverse books that I want you to have on your radar. The first is With Dad, which is a really beautiful, quiet story about a little boy whose father was recently deployed. And he reflects back on moments that he shared with his father as he looks towards the future and awaits his return. Another is Watercress, which is a story. I actually used this title to do a planning session for the middle grade, so feel free to check that out. But Watercress is one of my favorites right now. It's about a young girl whose parents are first-generation immigrants from China. And at the start of the story, she's ashamed of a part of her family's culture. And as she learns more, becomes very proud of her family and her heritage. Other great titles to check out, My Puppy Has a Motorcycle and The Proudest Blue. And remember to check out Lee and Lowe, diversebooks.org, and Cornelius Rip on Instagram for other great suggestions. Okay, we're going to take a moment now to build upon our previous learning. The work that we're doing today stands on the shoulders of what we've learned in the first two webinars. So as a reminder, we learned about this phrase and this philosophy, mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors, that was coined by Rudine Sims Bishop in 1990. We learned that there's a big problem in our country right now. There are not enough diverse books being published, and that's problematic for the students in our classroom because consequently, we do not have enough diverse books on our classroom shelves. So we talked about the importance that every student needs ample opportunities to interact with mirrors. And mirrors are texts that reflect one or more aspects of a student's identity or experience. They also need many opportunities to interact with windows or texts that offer insight into somebody else's experience or world. And we then discussed how do we do this? How do we start to curate a more diverse collection of books so that our students do have those opportunities to interact with mirrors, affirming their own identity, and windows to start learning about people different from themselves in order to create a very accepting, nurturing, and tolerant classroom community. Then we answer the essential question. Well, once we are successful in diversifying our classroom library, how do we interact with these stories in a way that's meaningful for our students? And I introduced to you the interactive read aloud, which is a model for teaching reading skills and strategies through stories, okay? It's a sacred time when teacher pulls students together to share a text. It's very short, 15 to 20 minutes max. And it's where teacher models thinking aloud or reading strategy, and then students practice. And the beauty of this is that obviously it's really effective for reading strategies, but it's also great for SEL strategies, such as building empathy for people different from ourselves. So we discussed this model. I did a demo lesson, and hopefully you are starting to become a bit familiar with this structure. Okay. So today, building upon what we've already learned, the essential question for today is how can we plan an interactive read aloud that cultivates empathy for people different from ourselves? And some buzzwords are empathy, we talked about last session, is the ability to understand and share the feeling of others. And window, as we just discussed, are texts that offer insight into someone else's experience or world. Now, I want to take a moment to explain that for this session and for all the planning sessions, we're focusing on windows. Mirrors are super important to have students interact with, obviously, so that they can see themselves and validate their own identity. We're focusing on windows in order to help build classroom community so that students can learn to be more empathic towards people who are different from themselves. And when we use windows, stories that are windows for our students, it allows them the opportunity to practice this skill. Okay, so I want you to take a moment to get organized. Last webinar, I introduced to you a lesson planning template for the interactive read aloud that hopefully is helpful in planning your own interactive read alouds. And I think it would be great for you to download this lesson plan template from the Greeley website. So you can find it on the Greeley Center website under Creating a Classroom Culture Through Literacy. So if you could just pause this and take a moment to download that, it might be helpful in our collaborative planning work today. All right, so hopefully you were able to locate it. If you weren't for some reason, here's a quick image of the interactive read aloud lesson plan. As you can see, it walks you through each part of the interactive read aloud. So the book introduction, the teacher think aloud 1, and then the student practice 1, the teacher think aloud 2, and then the student practice 2, and then the big discussion questions, 1 or 2 of which might relate back to that big skill, okay? Okay, so for this part of our session, I want you to pretend like we're sitting in a coffee shop or a teacher's lounge and we're planning an interactive read aloud together in the hopes of helping students to learn how to be more empathic towards characters or people that might be different from themselves. So I'm going to walk you through the 4 big steps. The first step is to choose a story that features diverse characters, settings, or problems, one that serves as a window for your own particular students. Now, this is important because a window is different for every population of students and for every individual student, right? So it's really important that you obviously look at your students, know your students' identity, where they come from, who they are, when choosing a text that serves as a window for them. So I might feature a window, an example of a window that you might be thinking, well, that's not actually a window for my students. It might be a mirror, which is great, which is totally fine. So obviously keeping that in mind, that when you're choosing a good text match for your students, you have to really know your students when doing so. Okay, the second step is once you choose a story, you want to read the text through the lens, which parts are emotionally heightened and might be good opportunities for students to practice standing in the shoes of the character, and you want to mark those spots. What the moments and stories that we find to be emotionally heightened and that we respond to, our students are likely to have a similar response. Then we want to determine which empathizing strategies might be most fitting to teach at those parts. After, you want to plan your model, think aloud, your turn and talk setups, and discussion questions. Okay, this particular planning session, I chose A Different Pond by Bao Fee. And so I'm going to give you a quick summary just because I know you guys don't have the text in front of you. I think it just might be more efficient than reading the whole story aloud. Okay. So A Different Pond is about a little boy and his father who wake up really early in the morning, in order to go fishing at a pond in where they live in Minneapolis. And they're doing this to catch fish for food, for dinner. So they depend on this to eat. And as they're there and they're quietly fishing together, the father starts to talk about a different pond across the world where he used to go fishing with his brother, who never returned home from war. And he talks a little bit about this different pond in Vietnam. And through this experience, the little boy starts to really appreciate where his father came from and the sacrifices he makes for his family to live in America. So I love this story for a lot of different reasons, for the small moments that it really illustrates between the father and the son, and also because it serves as a window for students who are not familiar with this experience of being a child to first-generation immigrants. So a little bit about the story, and hopefully that's enough for you to really participate in this planning session. So after I chose the story, this is step 2, that I read the text through the lens, which parts are emotionally heightened and might be good opportunities for students to practice standing in the shoes of the character. So I did that. I went through the process, and I'll show you those stopping points in just a minute. And then I asked myself, well, which empathizing strategies might be most fitting to teach at those specific parts? So as a reminder, here are some of the strategies we have that we can use that readers empathize with characters by asking, if I were in this character's shoes, what would I be thinking right now? What would I be wishing for right now? What would I be worried about right now? What would I say or do right now? So I've identified the book. I marked the emotionally heightened parts of the story, and I determined some empathizing strategies that I think might work. Now we're going to plan our model think aloud, turn and talk setups, and discussion questions, and we're going to do this together. You can use the planning template to help you as we go through this process. It might be helpful to have out in front of you. So I have done the first teacher think aloud and the first student stopping point together as a model, okay? So you'll see here on this page, I'm going to read it to you because this is one of the first parts of the story that I marked as being, as reacting to emotionally. You're here early today, the bait man says. I got a second job, my dad explains. I have to work this morning. On a Saturday? The bait man asks. My dad nods. So I'm going to pause here, okay? Because it just revealed a lot about the dad and about how he conducts himself, right? So I also wondered as I read this page what the little boy, what the narrator is thinking when he hears this conversation. Okay. So I thought it would be a good opportunity for students to practice empathizing and for me to model this. So if you were students and I was in front of you, I might say, okay, we're going to stop here. And I'm going to show you how we can empathize with characters by asking, if I were in the character's shoes, what would I be thinking right now? So I want you to watch me as I do that. So, okay. So I think if I were in the narrator's shoes, in the little boy's shoes, I might be thinking that I feel sorry for my dad, that we're here so early and that he had got a second job, and after this he's going to another job. And I also might be thinking that, wow, that's a bummer that it's a Saturday and I can't spend the day with my dad. I might be thinking that. I might be thinking that my dad is really, really hardworking, that he's working two jobs on a Saturday. But I want you to notice here how I can empathize with the character by asking, if I were in his shoes, what would I be thinking right now? Okay. And you're going to have a chance to do this in a few pages. Okay. So hopefully you see what I did there. Set them up with a little bit about what's going on the page, introduced the skill and strategy that I was going to be modeling, and then showed them how to actually apply the skill and strategy by thinking aloud. Okay. The next page that I marked is just being pretty emotional, and I thought a good stopping point for practicing empathizing is here. So they're walking towards the pond. My dad holds my hand and walks ahead through the tangle and scrub. Step where I step, he says. I'm thinking about what Dad told the bait man. If you got another job, why do we still have to fish for food? I ask. Everything in America costs a lot of money, he explains. I feel calluses on his hand when he squeezes mine. I'm going to pause there. So if I were talking to students, I would say, we're going to stop here. And now it's your turn to practice empathizing with the character by asking, if I were in his shoes, what would I be thinking right now? What would I be thinking right now? And I want you to put your thumb up when you're ready to share. And then I would have students turn and talk with their partner once I see that enough thumbs are up, meaning that they've had enough time to reflect on a meaningful answer. Okay? All right, so we just planned out, or I showed you how I planned out, the teacher think aloud 1 and then student practice 1. And now you're going to have an opportunity to plan out teacher think aloud 2 and student practice 2 with these next 2 pages, okay? So the first page is when they're having a conversation sitting by the pond fishing. I used to fish by a pond like this when I was a boy in Vietnam, Dad says, biting into his sandwich. With your brother? I ask. He nods and then looks away. Dad tells me about the war, but only sometimes. He and his brother fought side by side. One day, his brother didn't come home. Okay, so that's the first page that I think would be powerful to model an empathizing strategy with. And here's the second. This is when they return home from fishing. My dad changes his clothes and gets ready to go to work. He pats me on the back and says to Mom, our boy did a good job with the fire today. You learned so quickly, Mom says. Then she asks me to help with the fish before she has to go to work too. Okay, so I want you to pause this video and ask yourself, which same strategy would be powerful to teach at both of these stopping points? What would you say or do during the think aloud on the first page? And how would you set students up to practice turning and talking on the second page, okay? And remember, you can refer to the lesson plan template to help guide you. Okay, so hopefully you were able to just participate in that and craft your think aloud and model, and then your stopping point for students to practice. Then we know we wrap up this interactive read aloud by circling up our students and having a discussion. Now, I always encourage teachers to craft at least one discussion question that does relate back to the skill that you're teaching. In this case, it's empathizing with characters. But then you can go ahead and think about any other juicy questions that you think would get your students talking. So they might be about author's craft, might be about character development, might be about the setting, might be about literary techniques, whatever really pops out at you and that you think your students would learn from and enjoy discussing. So the first question I crafted here is empathy is the ability to feel what another person feels. Which point in the story were you able to experience the most empathy for the character? In other words, during which parts were you able to feel what he was feeling? Nervous, proud, ashamed? And then I added this one too, just because I feel like in this story, the narrator's so quiet. And I'm often wondering, like, what does he want to say to his mom and dad? Because I feel like he has a lot to say. And it also pushes our students to continue empathizing in a different way, really. So if you were the narrator, what would you want to tell your mom and dad? And then I want you to pause this video and I want you to try crafting a question. Okay, just based on the pages that you saw and the summary that I shared, what might be another discussion questions that might get your kids talking about the text? Okay, so we just went through the whole process of planning an interactive read aloud. So we chose a book, specifically planning an interactive read aloud that cultivates empathy, right, for people different from ourselves. So we chose a book. We marked parts of the book that we responded to emotionally. We asked ourselves which empathizing strategies might be effective to teach at those specific parts, and then we planned, okay? So next steps, I really suggest you synthesize this collaborative planning work and fill out the lesson planning template. I think this will help to familiarize yourself with the structure of the interactive read aloud. Ask your principal to purchase a copy of A Different Pond and and other diverse titles to continue diversifying your classroom library, and teach the lesson to your class. Like, give it a go if you've never taught an interactive read aloud and see how it goes, and then make a goal. How can you aim to teach one IRA focused on cultivating empathy a week? Remembering you can fit it in it's all different times throughout the day, after lunch and recess, before dismissal, all those funny kind of transitional times that you might come across, okay? As a quick reminder, I have recorded different planning sessions on cultivating empathy through picture books for these 4 different grade bands. So feel free to check each of these out. As we know, picture books and books in general are not confined just for specific grades. So hopefully it'll still be applicable to your grade level and still will be helpful to you. And as always, feel free to reach out to me, even if you're crafting a lesson plan and you want a second set of eyes to look it over, or you have questions about text choice. I would love to hear from you and continue learning and growing with you. So here is my contact information and feel free to use it. I would love to continue to support you. And thank you so much for joining us on our journey.